A vast archive of human thought turned to smoke and ash. The burning of the Library of Alexandria is remembered as a night that erased history itself, but the real story is far more complex. By the end of this video, you will understand the exact price humanity paid when that library fell, and why its loss still echoes today. We will uncover the specific plays, scientific theories, and entire histories that vanished from our world. This journey moves beyond the legend to a tangible inventory of absence, revealing how a single place held futures we can now only imagine. What does it truly mean when a civilization forgets? The ambition was staggering in its scope. One man, Ptolemy I, a former general who had fought alongside Alexander, looked at the bustling port city he now ruled and envisioned something far greater than a military stronghold. He wanted to build the world's brain. His project was not just a library but a universal archive, a single institution that would hold every known book from every known culture. Think about that for a moment. In an age when knowledge was painstakingly handwritten on fragile scrolls and scattered across continents from Greece to India, he aimed to bring it all under one roof. This was not born from simple curiosity, but from a calculated vision of soft power. By making Alexandria the repository of all human thought, Ptolemy could position his kingdom as the true heir to Alexander's legacy, the unchallenged intellectual and cultural capital of the known world. To achieve this, he established the Museum, a temple dedicated to the Muses, which functioned as the ancient world's first state-funded research university. Here, the greatest minds of the era, figures like the mathematician Euclid, were given salaries, lodging, and access to that growing collection purely to think, debate, and discover. But building such a collection required extraordinary measures. Ptolemy authorized a policy that seems almost unthinkable today. Any ship that docked in Alexandria's legendary harbor was boarded by royal scribes. Every scroll or book found on board was confiscated and taken to the library. There, teams of copyists would meticulously transcribe the text, and the copy, not the original, was returned to the ship's owners. Through this aggressive, systematic harvesting of written knowledge, the library's shelves swelled with hundreds of thousands of scrolls. It became a living, breathing institution, a magnet for genius that promised to compile the sum total of human understanding. Yet this very concentration of wisdom, this beautiful and fragile dream gathered in one place, created a profound and lasting vulnerability. The library's greatest threat would arrive not from neglect but from the chaos of war. In the year 48 before the Common Era, the Roman general Julius Caesar found himself trapped in Alexandria, his forces besieged by the army of the Egyptian king Ptolemy XIII. In a desperate military move, Caesar ordered his own fleet in the harbor to be set ablaze, creating a fiery barrier to prevent the enemy from using the ships or the docks. The plan worked as a tactic, but the consequences spiraled far beyond his control. A fierce wind carried the flames from the burning vessels onto the wooden piers and into the sprawling dockyard warehouses that lined the waterfront. And it was within these warehouses that a different kind of treasure was stored. Historians believe this area held the library's overflow, a secondary collection of scrolls fresh off the boats from across the Mediterranean and beyond. These were works in transit, newly arrived texts waiting to be examined, catalogued, and copied by the library's scribes before being added to the main collection. In that uncontrolled inferno, thousands of unique documents, perhaps the only copies of their kind in the world, were consumed before scholars ever had the chance to unroll them. This was not the destruction of the main library building, which was situated safely away in the royal quarter, but something in some ways more tragic. It was the loss of potential, the silencing of voices that had just arrived to join the great conversation, only to be erased at the doorstep. While the great library's heart continued to beat, this event severed a vital artery, cutting off a stream of new knowledge and diminishing the diversity of thought it was meant to preserve. The fire in the harbor was a warning, a demonstration of how fragile this grand repository was when caught in the crossfire of empire. To grasp the true scale of the fire's impact, we need to step inside those legendary halls and see what was actually on the shelves. The library was not a single room but a sprawling complex of study rooms, lecture halls, and storage galleries, all organized with a meticulous system that would feel familiar in a modern university. Its collection was sorted by genre and language, a vast catalogue of human curiosity. At its peak, it held hundreds of thousands of papyrus scrolls, each one a unique vessel of thought, painstakingly copied by hand. This was not a random assortment of books. It was a curated, living record of civilization's highest achievements, and its contents tell us exactly what was at risk when the flames spread. The literary losses alone are staggering. The library held the definitive, authorized copies of the great Greek playwrights. We know the names Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides today, but we know only a fraction of their work. Aeschylus wrote perhaps 90 plays in his lifetime. Only 7 have survived to the modern day. Sophocles and Euripides each wrote over 90 plays as well, and we have just a handful of each. Where did the rest go? The complete collections, the full breadth of their genius exploring tragedy, comedy, and the human condition, resided in Alexandria. Their loss means we are listening to a symphony with most of its notes forever silenced, leaving us to guess at the full scope of their artistic vision. Then there were the histories, the foundational stories of ancient cultures written by their own people. The library housed the works of scholars like Berossus, a Babylonian priest who compiled 3,000 years of Mesopotamian history, astronomy, and mythology into a single authoritative text. It held the writings of the Egyptian historian Manetho, who created the dynastic chronology of the pharaohs that Egyptologists still use as a framework today. These were not second-hand accounts. They were primary sources, direct transmissions from cultures with deep, recorded memories. Today, we have only fragments and references to these works in later texts. The originals, the comprehensive narratives, were almost certainly reduced to ash. This loss severed our direct connection to how these civilizations understood their own past, leaving enormous gaps in the historical record that archaeology can only partially fill. Perhaps the most profound losses were in the halls of science and medicine. The library contained the original writings of Aristarchus of Samos, an astronomer who, nearly 2,000 years before Copernicus, proposed a model of the universe with the sun at the center and the earth revolving around it. His work was a spark of brilliant insight that was ultimately dismissed and forgotten by later scholars. Had his full theory survived intact within the library's respected walls, could it have changed the course of scientific thought? We will never know. Alongside such revolutionary ideas were the foundational texts of medicine. The library held the core treatises of the Hippocratic school, the original observations and case studies that established medicine as a discipline based on observation rather than superstition. These scrolls contained centuries of accumulated knowledge about anatomy, surgery, and the treatment of illness, a database of practical healing that vanished. The destruction of this archive did not just burn paper, it erased potential futures, closing doors to lines of inquiry and understanding that humanity would have to painfully rediscover centuries later. The true tragedy lies in the specific titles, the named works we know existed but can no longer read. Think of the library as a vast literary ecosystem, a rainforest of stories where we have only catalogued a few surviving trees. The works of Aeschylus and Sophocles that we read today are but a tiny fraction of their creative output. Aeschylus, often called the father of tragedy, was credited with over 70 plays. We have the texts for just 7. Sophocles wrote more than 120 dramatic works, and again, only 7 complete plays have made the journey to our time. The Library of Alexandria held the complete collections, the authorized editions that would have contained every line they ever wrote for the stage. This means we have lost not just individual stories, but the entire arc of their artistic evolution. Imagine being able to trace the development of Shakespeare's genius if we had only Hamlet and Macbeth, but none of his earlier experiments or later, more complex works. That is the scale of our loss. We see these playwrights as masters of a specific form, but their vanished works almost certainly included comedies, satyr plays filled with mythical satire, and tragedies on subjects we can no longer imagine. Their complete absence silences whole registers of the ancient Greek emotional experience. Beyond these giants, there were entire genres that flickered out of existence. The Hellenistic epyllion, a kind of short, highly polished epic poem, is a literary form we know almost solely from descriptions by other ancient critics. We have the name, we know it was popular and artistically significant, but without a single complete surviving example from the library's shelves, we cannot hear its rhythm or feel its power. It is a ghost in the history of literature. Then there is the poignant case of Sappho, the poet from the island of Lesbos whose words on love and longing were so celebrated that she was called the 10th Muse. Her collected works filled 9 papyrus volumes in the library, a comprehensive archive of her lyric genius. Today, we have mostly fragments, sometimes just a single breathtaking line recovered from the scraps of papyrus used to wrap Egyptian mummies or the margins of later manuscripts. We read a phrase like "you burn me," and we can sense the heat of a complete poem, the shape of a lost emotional world that we will never fully reconstruct. The burning of these scrolls was not merely the loss of data. It was the erasure of specific human voices, of artistic movements, of the precise ways an ancient people expressed joy, grief, desire, and wonder. Our connection to their inner lives was severed, leaving our own cultural memory permanently and profoundly impoverished. What melodies in those lost poems might still resonate in us today? The loss of those literary works is a cultural tragedy, but the burning of the library's historical archives created a different kind of void, one that still shapes our understanding of the ancient world today. This was not just the loss of stories, but the loss of memory itself. The librarians of Alexandria understood that to know the world, you had to know its past, and so they systematically gathered the national histories of every civilization they encountered. These were not Greek accounts looking in from the outside. They were the definitive chronicles written by the people who lived that history, often by priests and scholars who had direct access to temple archives and royal records that have long since turned to dust. When these primary sources burned, it plunged entire millennia into a shadow from which we have never fully emerged. Take, for instance, the 3-volume history known as the Babylonioka, written by a priest named Berossus. He was a Babylonian scholar living in the time of Alexander, a man who could walk into the great temple libraries of Babylon and read the original cuneiform tablets. His work was a monumental synthesis compiling 3,000 years of Mesopotamian history, astronomy, and mythology into a single authoritative text for a Greek-speaking audience. He translated the creation epic Enuma Elish and provided a list of kings that stretched back into legendary time. Today, we know of Berossus only through tiny fragments and references quoted by later Greek historians. The complete Babylonioka, with its detailed narratives and precise chronologies, is gone. Its destruction means that the story of one of humanity's first civilizations, told by one of its own most learned citizens, is now a puzzle with most of the pieces missing. We are left trying to reconstruct the history of Mesopotamia from archaeological digs and broken monuments, a silent testimony where once there was a full and eloquent voice. The same fate befell the Egyptiocha, the history of Egypt written by the priest Manetho. Commissioned by the Ptolemaic kings themselves, Manetho had unparalleled access to the temple records and king lists of his homeland. He organized the chaotic procession of Egyptian pharaohs into the 30 dynasties that Egyptologists still use as their basic framework today. But the full text of his work, which would have contained detailed narratives, lengths of reigns, and accounts of major events for each ruler, has not survived. We have summaries and excerpts preserved by later writers, but the original, comprehensive history is lost. This creates a maddening situation for modern scholars. They can stand before the tomb of a pharaoh, marvel at the art and architecture, but without Manetho's complete chronicle, they often cannot place that ruler precisely in time or understand the full context of their reign. It is like having a family photo album with breathtaking pictures, but someone has torn out all the pages that explained who the people were and how they were related to one another. This historical blackout extends far beyond Babylon and Egypt. The library held the national histories of the Persians, the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, and countless other cultures. These were the foundational documents, the first drafts of civilization written by the civilizations themselves. Their destruction forced all subsequent history to be written from secondary sources, often from the perspectives of their Greek and Roman rivals or conquerors. We view these ancient empires through a filtered, often biased lens, because the original accounts that would have given us their own sense of identity, their own justifications for action, and their own cultural pride were turned to ash in Alexandria. The fire did not just burn papyrus, it created a permanent fog over the past, ensuring that for vast stretches of human history, we are forever listening for an echo instead of hearing the original voice. What definitive answers about the rise and fall of empires might those scrolls have held? The silence left by those lost histories is profound, but the library's scientific wing holds an even more haunting kind of absence. Here, among the scrolls detailing experiments and observations, were not just lost facts but lost futures. The library was not merely an archive for completed ideas, it was an active laboratory for the mind, where some of the most radical theories about the nature of reality were being proposed, debated, and written down. When those specific texts burned, they didn't just erase knowledge, they erased possibilities, redirecting the very path of human discovery down a different, and perhaps slower, road. To walk those halls was to encounter the ghosts of sciences that could have been. Consider the case of Strato of Lampsacus, a thinker so dedicated to observation and experiment that he earned the nickname the physicist. While Aristotle, his predecessor, often reasoned from first principles, Strato insisted on testing the physical world. He conducted early investigations into vacuums and the behavior of falling bodies, meticulously recording how objects accelerate as they drop. His writings represented a crucial, empirical step toward the science of physics. Yet today, we know of Strato's pioneering work only through brief, admiring mentions by later philosophers. His own detailed notes, his experimental logs, the scrolls that could have provided a direct link between ancient philosophy and modern scientific method, are gone. Without them, that empirical thread was broken, and the world would wait over 1,000 years for thinkers to systematically rebuild that experimental approach from scratch. Then there were the engineers, the practical geniuses who turned theory into invention. The library held the complete works of Ctesibius, a man considered the father of pneumatics. Within his scrolls were detailed designs for marvels like the precision water clock, which measured time by the steady flow of liquid, and the force pump, a device that used compressed air to move water. These were not mere sketches, they were working plans, the ancient equivalent of engineering textbooks. While we have later Roman descriptions that borrowed from his ideas, Ctesibius's original, comprehensive manuals vanished. Their loss meant that the foundational principles of hydraulic and pneumatic engineering had to be intermittently rediscovered, rather than built upon in a continuous, accelerating tradition. Imagine the cumulative progress that was stalled because a master's complete course of instruction was reduced to ashes. But of all the scientific ghosts, the most significant may be that of Aristarchus of Samos. Nearly 2,000 years before Nicolaus Copernicus, Aristarchus looked at the heavens and proposed a shocking idea. He argued, based on his own astronomical observations and calculations, that the Earth was not the center of the universe. Instead, he placed the Sun at that central point, with our planet revolving around it. His full treatise on the sizes and distances of the Sun and Moon was a cornerstone of the library's collection. It was a working heliocentric model, a correct map of the solar system waiting to be confirmed. Yet the intellectual weight of Aristotle's geocentric universe and the later influence of Ptolemy's complex but wrong astronomical system pushed Aristarchus's theory to the margins. His scrolls, stored in the Great Archive, became curiosities rather than catalysts, and then they were gone. The complete, persuasive argument for a sun-centered cosmos was erased from the mainstream of thought. Had it survived intact, being copied and debated by generations of scholars within that respected institution, could it have taken root? Might the scientific revolution have begun in the Roman era instead of the Renaissance? We cannot know, but the loss of Aristarchus's work represents one of the clearest examples of a door to the future being closed. His was not a forgotten idea, it was an extinguished one, and the darkness it left behind lasted for 17 centuries. What other doors leading to understandings we have yet to even conceive were sealed shut on that same day, but the library's shelves held more than just histories and scientific theories. They contained entire philosophies, complete schools of thought that offered different answers to life's biggest questions. Today, we think of ancient philosophy as a conversation dominated by a few famous names, primarily Plato and Aristotle. Their works survived through diligent copying in medieval monasteries, and they became the foundation of Western thought. Yet the Library of Alexandria presented a far richer, more contentious, and more diverse intellectual landscape. It preserved the full spectrum of human wisdom, including rival systems that challenged everything the mainstream believed. When those alternative scrolls burned, we didn't just lose arguments. We lost whole ways of seeing the world, narrowing the philosophical options available to future generations and funneling Western culture down a more singular path. To walk through its philosophy section would have been to encounter minds that questioned reality at its most fundamental level. There, in their entirety, were the works of the pre-Socratic thinkers, the pioneers who first asked what the universe was made of. One of the most significant was Democritus. Centuries before modern chemistry, he developed a theory of atomism, proposing that everything in existence, the air, the stars, was composed of tiny, indivisible particles called atoms moving through a void. His writings were not brief fragments, but extensive volumes exploring the implications of this idea for physics, ethics, and the nature of the soul. The library held his complete system. Its loss meant that atomic theory vanished as a serious philosophical contender for over a millennium, remembered only as a curious footnote in the works of its critics rather than the profound scientific intuition it was. Imagine how the history of science might have differed if scholars in the Middle Ages had access to Democritus's full rationale. A detailed ancient argument for a physical reality built from fundamental particles. Beyond the nature of matter, the library housed competing visions for how to live a good life. We know the Stoics and the Epicureans by reputation, but our understanding is pieced together from quotes, letters, and later summaries. The library held the original, comprehensive teachings of their founders. Zeno of Citium, who founded Stoicism, taught in a painted colonnade or stoa in Athens. His lectures were transcribed into authoritative texts that outlined a complete philosophy of logic, physics, and ethics centered on virtue, acceptance, and living in accordance with nature. Epicurus, often mistakenly associated with mere pleasure-seeking, actually taught a sophisticated system for achieving freedom from fear and pain through modest living, friendship, and the study of the natural world. The loss of their complete works means we have their philosophies in outline, but we miss the nuance, the supporting arguments, and the full depth of their practical guidance. Later thinkers had to reconstruct these systems from incomplete copies, leaving room for misinterpretation that has lasted to this day. Even more radical were the schools whose voices were almost entirely silenced. The library safeguarded the texts of the skeptics, who doubted the possibility of certain knowledge and advocated for a suspended judgment to achieve peace of mind. It held the works of the Cyrenaics, who argued that the immediate sensation of pleasure was the only true good, and it preserved the challenging teachings of the Cynics, like Diogenes, who lived in a tub and rejected all social conventions in pursuit of a life of radical self-sufficiency and honesty. These were not minor footnotes. They were robust, developed philosophies offering legitimate, coherent alternatives to the Platonic and Aristotelian mainstream. Their presence in the library ensured they remained part of the living debate. Their destruction meant that when the intellectual tradition was later filtered through the medieval world, these challenging, unconventional voices had largely faded away. The philosophical canon that was passed down was by necessity a narrower one. The consequence of this loss is subtle but immense. The surviving works of Plato and Aristotle are profound, but they represent specific branches on a much larger tree of human thought. By losing the competing systems held in Alexandria, the Western intellectual tradition was shaped with fewer tools in its toolkit, fewer lenses through which to examine existence. The great debates of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment were reignited primarily from the sparks of the surviving classics. What new syntheses, what entirely different schools of philosophy might have emerged if thinkers like Descartes or Kant had also been able to engage with the complete works of Democritus or the full, nuanced arguments of the skeptics and cynics? The fire did not just burn papyrus, it reduced a vibrant, multi-voiced debate to a more focused and perhaps more limited dialogue. We are left to wonder what insights for modern life, what solutions to ancient human problems were extinguished in that blaze, leaving our own philosophical inheritance both brilliant and, in ways we can barely perceive, incomplete. Yet the most personal cost of the fire may have been paid in the halls of healing. Within the library's complex stood one of the ancient world's most advanced medical schools, a place where for a brief, revolutionary period, scholars were permitted to do the unthinkable, study the human body from the inside. The physician Herophilus, working in Alexandria during the 3rd century before the Common Era, was granted a unique and controversial privilege by the Ptolemaic kings. He was allowed to perform systematic dissections on human cadavers, a practice considered deeply taboo in both Greek and Egyptian culture. This unprecedented access led to discoveries that shattered centuries of assumption. Peering into the opened body, Herophilus identified the brain, not the heart, as the true center of intelligence and the commander of the nervous system. He meticulously traced the pathways of nerves, distinguishing them from tendons for the first time, and described the intricate structures of the eye, the liver, and the reproductive organs. His findings were recorded in exhaustive detail, accompanied by precise anatomical drawings that translated observation into a teachable science. These were not speculative texts. They were the first accurate maps of the human form based on direct evidence, and every single scroll of his work is gone. The loss is not just of facts but of a foundational moment. Herophilus had established a methodology of seeing for oneself, a principle that would be extinguished for over 1,000 years. His contemporary, Aristarchus, took this empirical approach further. By observing the body's structures, he developed early theories about the circulatory system, proposing that arteries and veins carried different substances, and he investigated the function of the heart valves. His writings on cardiology and physiology represented a path not taken, a branch of medical science that simply stopped growing. The reason for this intellectual halt was both political and cultural. As Rome absorbed Greek learning, human dissection was banned entirely. The practice that had fueled Alexandria's medical breakthroughs was deemed a violation, closing the only window physicians had into the body's living architecture. This created a devastating knowledge vacuum. Centuries later, the great Roman physician Galen, whose theories would dominate medicine for the next 1500 years, was forced to work under this constraint. Unable to dissect humans, he conducted his research primarily on pigs, dogs, and apes. He then tried to fill the gaps in his understanding by consulting the works of Herophilus and Aristarchus, which were still available in his time. But after the library's destruction, those reference texts vanished for all who came after. Galen's brilliant but flawed conclusions, based on animal anatomy and second-hand knowledge of those lost human studies, became the unchallenged medical canon. Errors about the flow of blood, the structure of organs, and the workings of the brain were copied and recopied, embedded like fossils in the bedrock of medieval medicine. Physicians for generations would diagnose and treat the human body using a guidebook that was, in critical ways, a map of the wrong territory. The Renaissance rediscovery of human dissection by figures like Andreas Vesalius was not just an advance, it was a correction. A painfully slow return to a point of understanding that Alexandria had reached and recorded, but which the world had been forced to forget. How many lives might have been saved, how much suffering alleviated, if those precise anatomical drawings had survived to guide the healer's hand? These medical texts were a map to the inner human, but the library held another kind of map entirely, one that charted the outer world in breathtaking detail. Beyond the scrolls of philosophy and science lay a geography section, a treasury of exploration that contained something far more valuable than simple directions. It held the first-hand accounts of sailors who had pushed past the edge of the known world, men who had seen coastlines no Greek or Roman scholar had ever walked. These were not dry academic treatises. They were the periply, practical sailing manuals written by captains for other captains, filled with the kind of knowledge that kept a ship alive. They logged distances between ports, noted the locations of fresh water springs, warned of treacherous currents, and recorded the seasonal patterns of the winds. They were the ancient equivalent of GPS combined with a pilot's almanac, and their lost stranded future navigators in a sea of renewed uncertainty. Among these irreplaceable logs were the complete records of legendary journeys that have since faded into semi-myth. Hanno the Carthaginian, a navigator from a rival empire, had led a fleet south along the uncharted western coast of Africa. His detailed report, inscribed on a tablet in Carthage and surely copied for the library, described encounters with gorillas he called hairy wild men, volcanoes lighting the night sky, and rivers teeming with hippopotamuses. It was a tangible account of sub-Saharan Africa centuries before regular contact, a document that could have anchored geographical knowledge in reality. Instead, only a brief, summarized Greek translation of his voyage survived outside the library, leaving most of his precise observations to vanish. Without Hanno's full log, the vast coastline of West Africa remained a blank space on the map for European cartographers, a void quickly filled with illustrations of sea monsters and legends of a torrid, uninhabitable zone. An even more profound loss was the work of Pytheas of Massalia, a Greek explorer from the colony of Marseille. In the 4th century before the Common Era, Pytheas undertook an astonishing voyage north, passing through the British Isles and venturing into the cold waters of the North Sea. His text on the ocean was a masterpiece of early scientific exploration. He was the first Mediterranean writer to describe the midnight sun of the Arctic summer, the phenomenon of the polar ice pack, which he called the curdled sea, and the Germanic tribes of the Baltic coast. He even calculated the latitude of his northernmost stop with remarkable accuracy using simple astronomical tools. His account provided the first coherent picture of northwestern Europe, replacing vague tales of a land of perpetual fog with hard-won data. The library held his original, comprehensive narrative. Its destruction meant that later Roman geographers, like the respected Strabo, dismissed Pytheas as a fabulist and a liar. Strabo, working from fragments and rumors, could not conceive of a frozen ocean or a sun that did not set, so he simply rejected the report. This dismissal had a cascading effect. For centuries, the most accurate information about Britain, the North Sea, and the Arctic was suppressed in favor of more conservative and wildly incorrect models of the world. The loss of these explorers' voices did more than just shrink maps. It erased entire peoples from the shared record. Embedded within these sailing logs were priceless ethnographic observations. Pytheas did not just note coastlines, he described the customs of the Celtic tribes he met, their agriculture, their social structures. Hanno's account likely held similar details about the African communities he encountered. This was cultural anthropology in its earliest form, a snapshot of diverse human societies taken at a specific moment in time. When these texts burned, that moment was lost forever. The library's geography section was a window to a world far wider than the Mediterranean. Its destruction did not just burn parchment. It pulled a curtain across that window, leaving later generations to stare at their own reflections, their own assumptions and fears projected onto the empty spaces beyond. What accurate star charts for northern navigation, what understanding of Atlantic tides, what respectful records of lost cultures turned to smoke that day. The monsters that later medieval mapmakers drew at the edges of the world were not just fantasy. They were the children of that ignorance, born from the ashes of reports that could have shown them there was only ocean and land and other human beings. Beyond maps and medical texts, the library served as the ancient world's great translation bureau, a place where the very architecture of language was studied and preserved. Its scholars understood that to gather all the world's knowledge, they first had to master all the world's words. This was not a passive collection of scrolls in foreign tongues, but an active, scholarly mission to create bridges of understanding. The most famous product of this effort is the Septuagint, the monumental Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. A project legend says was undertaken by 72 Jewish scholars brought to Alexandria. This work alone reshaped religious history, making Jewish scripture accessible to the Greek-speaking world and directly influencing the language of the early Christian New Testament. But the library's linguistic ambition stretched far beyond this single, monumental text. It was here that the first critical editions of Homer's epics were produced, with scholars comparing dozens of variant manuscripts line by line to establish a definitive version of the Iliad and the Odyssey. This meticulous, comparative work was the birthplace of textual criticism, a discipline that taught the world how to carefully reconstruct an author's original words from a fog of copies and errors. Yet the library's true linguistic treasure, and perhaps its most overlooked loss, lay in its archives dedicated to languages that have since fallen completely silent. The scholars of Alexandria compiled the world's first grammars and dictionaries for tongues like Etruscan, Thracian, and various Anatolian dialects. These were not simple phrasebooks. They were systematic studies, the first attempts at what we now call comparative philology, the science of analyzing languages' relationships and structures. Imagine a detailed Etruscan Greek lexicon, painstakingly written by a bilingual scholar. It would have listed thousands of Etruscan words with their Greek equivalents, providing not just vocabulary, but insight into Etruscan grammar, verb conjugations, and sentence structure. For a language like Etruscan, which dominated Italy before Rome and profoundly influenced Latin, such a document would be the master key. Today, despite having thousands of Etruscan inscriptions, from temple walls to funeral urns, linguists can only understand a fraction of them. The language remains largely undeciphered because we lack a substantial bilingual text, a Rosetta Stone. The library almost certainly held that Rosetta Stone in the form of scholarly works created when Etruscan was still a living, spoken tongue. Their loss means the vibrant culture of the Etruscans, their literature, their laws, their own history written in their own hand, is forever muffled. We see their stunning art in museums, but we cannot hear their jokes, their prayers, or their poetry. The same tragedy applies to the Thracians, a powerful civilization in the Balkans, and to the myriad peoples of ancient Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. The library's lexicons for these languages represented unique snapshots taken at the moment when these cultures interacted with the Greek world. They were bridges built just before the rivers they spanned dried up forever. The burning of these linguistic guides did more than erase vocabulary lists. It demolished the very bridges that could have connected us to the inner worlds of dozens of ancient societies. Without them, we are left with archaeological artifacts, pottery, weapons, tombs, but not the words that gave those objects meaning. We cannot know what names they gave to their gods, what terms they used for love or justice, how they spoke to their children. This loss is a wall of silence built between us and the daily thoughts of countless generations. The library's grammars were not just academic exercises. They were passports to lost nations of the mind, and their ashes scattered those nations to the winds of time. What conversations from the forums of ancient Etruria or the markets of Thrace might we have finally overheard if those scholarly keys had survived? The story of a single, catastrophic fire is a comforting myth, but history is rarely so simple. The Library of Alexandria did not die in one grand conflagration. It suffered a slow, painful decline over centuries, punctuated by a final, definitive blow that was not an accident of war, but an act of deliberate erasure. By the late 4th century of the Common Era, the world had transformed. The Roman Empire was now officially Christian, and old pagan traditions were under direct assault. In the year 391, Emperor Theodosius I issued a series of sweeping edicts that banned pagan worship and ordered the closing of its temples. In Alexandria, a city long divided between its cosmopolitan Greek heritage, its ancient Egyptian roots, and its growing Christian community, these decrees ignited a tinderbox of sectarian tension. The flashpoint was the Serapeum, the magnificent temple of Serapis. This was not just a place of worship, it was a monumental complex that served as a cultural and intellectual heart of the city, and crucially, it housed a vast annex library. Many scholars believe this daughter library held a significant portion of what remained of the great collection, a curated archive of pagan philosophy, science, and religious texts. When a Christian mob, led by the patriarch Theophilus and backed by imperial authority, stormed the temple, they were not merely attacking statues. They were targeting a repository of ideas they now considered dangerous and heretical. The destruction was systematic and complete. The great cult statue of Serapis was hacked apart, dragged through the streets, and burned. The temple itself was looted and then consecrated as a Christian church. And the library within its walls, whatever scrolls had survived the earlier centuries of neglect, political turmoil, and Caesar's fire, was almost certainly put to the torch. This was not the loss of overflow or potential, as with the harbor fire. This was the intentional silencing of a specific branch of human thought. The ideal that had built the library, the gathering of all knowledge from all cultures and traditions, was now dead. In this new world, knowledge was no longer universal. It was orthodox or heretical, sacred or profane. a text on Platonic philosophy or a treatise on Egyptian astronomy was not just obsolete, it was an enemy to be purged. The burning of the Serapeum library symbolizes a profound shift from preservation to purification. It marks the moment when the guardians of a new truth decided that some chapters of the human story were better left unread. Their pages turned to ash to make way for a single, approved narrative. While the main library had likely faded long before, a shadow of its former glory, the violent end of the Serapeum was the closing of the book. It was the final, unambiguous statement that the age of the universal library and the fragile dream it represented was over. What last, unique insights into the pagan mind, what final alternatives in a narrowing world, were consumed in that second, decisive fire? Fire is a dramatic end, but silence can be a slower, more thorough eraser. While flames capture our imagination, the true killer of the Library of Alexandria was often simple indifference. After the Roman Empire absorbed Egypt, the great library faced a new and insidious threat, not from conquerors with torches, but from bureaucrats with ledgers. The Ptolemies had poured vast sums into their intellectual project, seeing it as a source of prestige and power. The Roman emperors, however, had a sprawling empire to manage and little personal investment in a Greek center of pagan learning. State funding, the lifeblood that paid for scribes, librarians, and the acquisition of new scrolls, slowly dried up. The library became a relic, maintained out of tradition rather than cherished as a vital organ of the state. Without a steady influx of resources, the great machine of knowledge preservation simply ground to a halt. New works from across the empire no longer flowed into its halls, cutting it off from the living stream of contemporary thought. It was becoming a museum, and even museums require caretakers. This financial neglect set the stage for a physical decay that was as inevitable as it was quiet. At the same time, the very technology of knowledge was undergoing a revolution. For centuries, the library's collection was written on papyrus, sheets made from the pith of the Nile reed, pressed and dried. Papyrus was relatively cheap in Egypt and suitable for scrolls, but it was fragile, susceptible to damp, mold, and hungry insects. A new medium was rising to take its place: parchment, made from treated animal skins. Parchment was far more durable and could be folded and bound into a new format, the codex, which we recognize today as the bound book. The codex was a superior technology, easier to reference, more compact to store, and far more resilient. As the Roman world gradually shifted from scrolls to codices, the library's immense collection of papyrus rolls began to look not just old but obsolete. Imagine a modern library refusing to digitize its collections, clinging solely to microfiche and cassette tapes while the world moves on. The incentive to meticulously copy hundreds of thousands of decaying scrolls onto new, expensive parchment simply wasn't there, especially without imperial patronage. So the scrolls sat and time worked on them. The process of decay was a silent, centuries-long tragedy. In the dry Egyptian air, papyrus could last, but in less than ideal conditions, it grew brittle and crumbled at the edges. Bookworms, the larvae of insects, literally ate through the layers of text, leaving tunnels of ignorance in their wake. Dampness invited mold that stained and consumed whole passages. But perhaps the most poignant fate for these ancient texts was reuse. Parchment was valuable. In a world where writing material was costly, a faded, outdated scroll presented an opportunity. Scribes would take these old texts, scrub or scrape the ink from the papyrus or parchment, and use the surface again. These recycled manuscripts are called palimpsests, from Greek words meaning scraped again. Beneath the new writing, often a Christian religious text, the ghost of the older work might linger, a faint trace waiting centuries for ultraviolet light to reveal it. How many unique works from the library ended their lives not in a blaze of glory, but as the raw material for a monastery's copy of the Psalms, This was knowledge not violently murdered but dismantled for parts. Each scroll that was reused, each text that molded away unseen, represented a quiet, individual subtraction from the total of human memory. This slow erosion by entropy and changing economics may have destroyed more than any single fire. It was a tragedy without villains or dramatic moments, just the steady, grinding passage of time and the shifting of priorities. While fire creates a stark before and after, this slow death left no moment to mourn, only a gradual fading until one day the shelves were simply empty. What unique voices faded to inaudible whispers in that long, silent interim? Yet the idea of a single, complete annihilation is itself a powerful myth. The silence was not absolute. Even in the early 5th century, a brilliant scholar named Hypatia stood in Alexandria's lecture halls, teaching advanced mathematics and philosophy. Her very existence as a public intellectual tells us something vital. She could not have taught Plato or astronomy from memory alone. She must have had access to texts, to a working library of some kind, however diminished. This reality forces a crucial correction to the story. The Library of Alexandria did not vanish in a puff of smoke, leaving the world in utter darkness. Instead, its light was scattered, and much of its most valued content had already escaped the city's walls long before the final fires. The works we consider the core of the Western canon, the complete dialogues of Plato, the foundational texts of Aristotle, the epic poems of Homer, had achieved a kind of immortality through replication. For centuries, scribes in Alexandria had been making copies, and those copies traveled. They found new homes in the scriptoriums of Constantinople, the scholarly circles of Antioch, and later, in the great translation houses of Baghdad. These were the bestsellers of the ancient world, the works deemed essential, and their wide circulation is precisely why we have them today. So the tragedy is not one of total erasure, but of a devastating filter. What burned were not the mainstream classics, but the outliers. The loss targeted the unique, the obscure, and the highly specialized. It consumed the single, authoritative copy of a Babylonian history that had never been translated. It took the only complete set of a playwright's lesser-known works, which no one had bothered to copy in full because the popular 7 were enough. It erased the dense, technical scroll of an engineer's diagrams, understood by only a handful of experts. Imagine a modern library fire that somehow only destroyed the rare manuscripts room, the archive of doctoral theses, the foreign language periodicals, and the complete technical manuals for obsolete technologies. The general collection of famous novels and history books would survive next door, but the deepest, most diverse layers of the collection would be gone forever. That is the more precise and in some ways more poignant catastrophe of Alexandria. The fire did not erase the central narrative of ancient thought. It erased the footnotes, the appendices, the alternative drafts, and the entire subplots. It narrowed the intellectual spectrum from a full rainbow of human inquiry down to a few dominant bands of light. We saved the chorus but lost countless verses. We preserved the melody, but an entire symphony of harmony was silenced. What wonders of human creativity and insight resided solely in those unique, uncopied scrolls, waiting for a future audience that would never arrive. Centuries after the final silence fell over Alexandria, a new beacon of learning was kindled far to the east. The Abbasid Caliphate, centered in the dazzling new city of Baghdad, became the stage for one of history's most ambitious intellectual rescue missions. Caliphs like Al-Mamun, driven by a profound curiosity and a desire to build an empire of the mind, established the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. This was not merely a library, but a vibrant, state-funded institute of translation and research. Its mandate was clear: to seek out the surviving scientific and philosophical wisdom of the ancient world, translate it into Arabic, and use it as a foundation for new discoveries. Scholars scoured the former territories of the Byzantine Empire, traveling to monasteries and scholarly centers where Greek manuscripts had been preserved, often by chance. In these remote archives, they recovered precious copies of works by Aristotle, the medical compilations of Galen, and the astronomical treatise of Ptolemy. Many of these scrolls were likely descendants of copies that had once been made in Alexandria, their lineage tracing back to that great original collection before its dispersal. This transfer of knowledge was not a simple act of preservation, it was an act of enhancement. Islamic scholars did not just translate, they scrutinized, commented upon, and corrected these ancient texts. They built upon Greek geometry, leading to breakthroughs in algebra and trigonometry. They refined Ptolemy's astronomical models with more precise observations. They tested and expanded Galen's medical knowledge through their own clinical practice. In this way, the House of Wisdom did not just save a legacy, it actively built upon it, creating a golden age of science and philosophy that would later help reignite learning in medieval Europe. Yet this magnificent rescue operation had a critical, defining limit. The scholars of Baghdad were pragmatic. They focused their immense efforts on texts they found immediately useful, philosophy that engaged with logic and metaphysics, medicine that could heal, astronomy that could aid navigation and timekeeping, and mathematics that could solve practical problems of engineering and inheritance law. This curated selection meant that a specific slice of Alexandrian thought was saved and magnified. But what of the texts deemed less practical or outside the core interests of this new scholarly tradition? The complete plays of Aeschylus, the national histories of Berosus and Manetho, the radical atomism of Democritus, the detailed travel logs of Pythias, these likely never made the journey to Baghdad. They held no apparent utility for the projects of the Abbasid court. Their absence from this great translation movement underscores a painful truth about how knowledge survives. It is not a random process, it is a series of conscious choices, a filtering based on the values, needs, and prejudices of the era doing the saving. The Islamic Golden Age performed a miracle, pulling a vast body of classical learning back from the brink of oblivion. But the filter it applied, however brilliant, was still a filter. It ensured that Aristotle's voice would echo through the centuries, while the voices of countless other thinkers, whose ideas might have offered different paths, faded into a silence from which there would be no return. What alternative branches on the tree of human thought were permanently pruned because they did not fit the needs of a new world? Perhaps the most haunting artifact lost in the flames was not a play or a history, but a map to the entire collection itself. The library's chief librarian, the poet Callimachus, undertook a task of staggering ambition to create a complete catalogue of everything the library held. He called his work the Pinax, meaning tables, and it filled 120 separate scrolls. This was not a simple inventory. It was the ancient world's first critical bibliography, a massive intellectual project that did far more than list titles. For every author represented in the library, Callimachus and his team wrote a brief biography, summarized the author's works, and even provided critical commentary and authenticity assessments. They organized the entire universe of knowledge into genres. Poetry was divided into epic, lyric, and tragic, prose into history, philosophy, and oratory. In doing so, Callimachus essentially invented the principles of library science, creating a system that allowed any scholar to navigate a sea of hundreds of thousands of scrolls. The destruction of the Pinax is a uniquely cruel twist in this story. We did not just lose the books, we lost the catalogue that told us what the books were. It is as if a great museum burned down, and with it, the only complete ledger describing every painting, sculpture, and artifact it contained. We are left sifting through the ashes, knowing a treasure was here, but without the list that tells us precisely what we are missing. This ghost catalogue holds the answers to questions that torment historians today. How many plays did Euripides actually write? The Pinax knew. What was the full title of Aristarchus's revolutionary astronomical text? The Pinax recorded it. What obscure historian from Phoenicia had his life's work archived there? The Pinax provided his biography. Without this guide, our understanding of the library's contents is based on fragments, guesses, and the occasional lucky reference in a surviving text. The Pinax would be the master key, transforming our vague sense of loss into a specific, heartbreaking ledger of absence. For modern archaeologists and linguists, its value would be incalculable. It would not only name lost works but could help identify anonymous fragments discovered in other ancient ruins. A piece of papyrus found in an Egyptian trash heap, bearing a few lines of unknown poetry, could be cross-referenced with the Pinax and suddenly gain an author, a title, and a place in the literary tradition. The Catalogue summaries would allow us to reconstruct the plots of lost epics and the arguments of vanished philosophical schools, giving body to ghosts. Its destruction means the great library's greatest scholarly achievement, the tool designed to make its collection accessible for all time, was itself consumed by the very forces of oblivion it was built to defy. We mourn the lost stories, but we also mourn the lost index, the magnificent map that showed the full, breathtaking scale of the continent that sank beneath the waves. The Catalogue's loss is a grand tragedy, but to grasp its true weight, we must zoom in from the vast collection to the individual creators. Behind every scroll listed in the Pinax was a human mind that devoted its life to a single, burning question. The fire did not just erase titles, it erased lifetimes. Consider the scholar Didymus Chalcyntorus, a name that literally means bronze guts, earned for his tireless, almost superhuman output. Working in Alexandria in the 1st century before the Common Era, he was a walking encyclopedia of Greek literature. He is said to have written over 3,500 separate works. These were not original poems or plays, but something equally vital, commentaries. He would take a single line from Homer or a complex passage from a tragic play and write an entire volume explaining its meaning, its historical context, its variant readings, and its place in the larger work. His scholarship was the bridge between the ancient texts and the students of his own time, a living guide to a cultural heritage, and not one of his 3,500 commentaries survives in full. We know of him only through scattered references in later writers. His life's work, a monumental act of preservation and explanation, was itself not preserved. It is as if every footnote, every critical essay, every professor's lecture notes on classic literature for 300 years suddenly vanished, leaving the books on the shelf but stripping away the shared understanding of how to read them. This was not a failure of his ideas, it was a catastrophic failure of the medium. His thoughts were entrusted to papyrus, gathered in one vulnerable place, and when that place was lost, Didymus himself was effectively erased from the conversation he had dedicated his life to sustaining. The same cruel fate met the genius of Apollonius of Perga, a mathematician of the 3rd century before the Common Era. While Euclid had mapped the geometry of straight lines and circles, Apollonius ventured into far more complex and beautiful territory. He wrote the definitive ancient work on conic sections, the elegant curves you get by slicing through a cone, the ellipse, the parabola, and the hyperbola. His treatise was a masterpiece of systematic thought, exploring the properties of these shapes with a depth and clarity that would not be matched for centuries. This was not abstract doodling. Conic sections would become, much later, the fundamental mathematics describing planetary orbits, the paths of projectiles, and the design of telescope lenses. Apollonius had laid the essential groundwork, yet we do not have his complete work. Of the original 8 books, only the first 4 survived the library's decline to be copied and passed down. The final 4 books, containing his most advanced explorations, are gone. We have their titles and a vague sense of their subjects from later summaries, but the detailed proofs, the intricate logical steps, the full expression of his culminating insights are lost. Having only half of a Polonius is like having the blueprint for a revolutionary engine, but missing the pages that explain how the fuel system and transmission work. The core idea is there, but the practical application, the completion of the system, must be painfully re-engineered by others over a millennium later. His incomplete legacy is a stark monument to the fragmentation of knowledge, a brilliant mind whose final thoughts we can only try to guess at. Then there are the inventors, the practical visionaries whose scrolls contained not just theory but buildable marvels. Philo of Byzantium was such an engineer. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, he traveled to Alexandria to study and contributed his own groundbreaking work to its collections. He wrote an expansive encyclopedia of mechanics called the Mechanique Syntaxis. In its volumes, he described in precise detail advanced siege engines with revolutionary iron-reinforced torsion springs, making them more powerful and accurate than anything before. But perhaps most captivating were his chapters on automata, self-operating machines powered by water, steam, and intricate systems of weights and pulleys. He described a singing mechanical bird, an automatic wine pourer for parties, and even an entire automated theater with moving figures that could perform a play. These were not mere fantasies, they were working plans, the ancient pinnacle of robotics. Philo's texts represented a path of technological development that viewed machines not just as tools of war, but as sources of wonder and cultural spectacle. Today, we have only fragments of his encyclopedia, recovered from a few later manuscripts and palimpsests. The bulk of his work, the complete manuals that could show us exactly how the ancient world approached complex automation, is ash. We see echoes of his ideas in later devices, but the original, comprehensive source is gone. The loss of Philo means we lost a full branch of engineering philosophy, one that saw mechanics as a theatrical art. Each of these scholars, Didymus the commentator, Apollonius the mathematician, and Philo the engineer, represents a unique constellation of thought. Their disappearances are not statistical blips in a grand tally of loss. They are individual silences, each a lifetime of observation, innovation, and dedication that reached a dead end because the physical scrolls that carried their voices were fragile, and they were stored in the one place history would repeatedly target. What other minds whose names we do not even know shared that fate? This raises a profound and unsettling question. What if the fire had never happened? What if the library's doors had remained open, its scrolls continuously copied, and its ideas steadily debated for another 1,000 years? We are left to contemplate not just what was lost, but the shape of the world that loss created. The absence of that archive did not simply pause history, it actively steered it down a narrower, more difficult path. With Aristarchus's sun-centered model preserved as a living theory within the greatest center of learning, would the intellectual grip of an earth-centered universe have been so absolute? The conflict between observation and doctrine that defined the Renaissance might have played out centuries earlier, potentially transforming the so-called Dark Ages into an era of accelerating cosmic understanding. The slow, painful rediscovery of basic principles could have been a rapid, confident building upon a foundation that was never allowed to crumble. Consider the philosophical landscape. The complete, accessible works of Democritus and the other pre-Socratic atomists would have provided a robust, ancient alternative to Aristotelian physics. Instead of being forgotten curiosities, their ideas could have remained part of the vital debate, offering a materialist framework for investigating nature. This could have seeded an earlier scientific revolution, one where the concept of fundamental particles was a starting point for inquiry, not a radical notion to be resurrected from oblivion. The very vocabulary of discovery would have been richer, the tools of thought more varied. progress often comes not from a single genius, but from the friction between competing ideas, and the library's destruction dramatically reduced that friction by silencing so many of the competing voices. The consequences extend beyond laboratories and observatories into the very way cultures understood each other. If the detailed national histories of Berossus and Manetho had survived as standard reference works, the past would not have been viewed primarily through a Greco-Roman lens. The achievements of Babylon and Egypt, of Persia and Phoenicia, would have been woven into the common historical narrative from the beginning, recognized as foundational pillars of civilization rather than exotic footnotes. This could have fostered a deeper, more inherent intercultural understanding, challenging ethnocentrism at its root. The library was built on the principle that wisdom had no single nationality, and its loss allowed a more monolithic view of history and human achievement to solidify, one that took centuries of global exploration and painful revisionism to begin to correct. Ultimately, the fire did not just burn scrolls, it burned potential futures. It eliminated entire branches on the tree of human knowledge, forcing civilization to regrow others slowly, often from stumps. The loss likely reinforced a worldview where knowledge was linear and centralized, flowing from a single approved source rather than a pluralistic, global conversation. The delay caused by this erasure is immeasurable. How many medical breakthroughs, technological leaps, or social innovations were postponed because the key insight was sitting on a shelf in Alexandria, waiting to be read by the wrong person at the wrong time? The library's fate is a permanent reminder that history is not just the story of what happened, but also the haunting story of what might have been, the ghostly outline of a brighter, more informed world that we were never allowed to inherit. That haunting outline of a brighter world is not just a relic of the past, it is a mirror reflecting our own digital age where we face eerily similar vulnerabilities. Our collective knowledge today is no longer stored on papyrus in a single, magnificent building, but on silicon in vast, centralized server farms. Yet the core challenge remains the same. How do we ensure that the voices of our era are not silenced by the inevitable march of time and technology? We confront our own forms of decay, data corruption that silently scrambles files, format obsolescence that renders yesterday's documents unreadable on today's machines, and catastrophic server failures that can wipe out entire archives in an instant. The transition from papyrus scrolls to parchment codices finds its parallel in our constant struggle to migrate data from floppy disks to CDs, from hard drives to cloud storage, a never-ending race against technological obsolescence. The centralization of knowledge presents perhaps the most direct parallel. Just as Alexandria gathered the world's scrolls into one vulnerable repository, we have entrusted immense swaths of our cultural record, from personal photographs to academic research, to a handful of corporate digital libraries and proprietary platforms. These modern repositories offer incredible convenience and access, but they create a single point of failure, whether from a technical crash, a shifting business model, or even a targeted cyber attack. The burning of the Serapeum, an act of ideological purification, finds its shadow in the potential for digital collections to be altered, censored, or simply deleted according to the policies of a private entity. This ancient history speaks directly to us, urging a conscious strategy for preservation. It champions the principle of decentralization, storing copies of vital knowledge in multiple, geographically separated locations so that no single disaster can erase it. It argues for the use of open access, non-proprietary file formats so that future generations are not locked out by defunct software. Most of all, it insists that preservation is not a one-time act, but an active, vigilant, and ongoing process, a duty that must be passed like a torch from one generation of stewards to the next. The lesson of Alexandria is not that we lost a library. It is that knowledge is never permanently safe. its survival is not guaranteed by the brilliance of its content, but by the relentless, human-driven effort to copy it, share it, and carry it forward into whatever strange formats the future may hold. Our task now is to learn from that ancient silence, to build systems with redundancy and resilience woven into their very code, ensuring that the digital conversations of our time do not one day become just another ghost catalogue of lost potential. The legend is etched in memory, but the stones have been harder to find. For all its towering fame in history, the precise physical footprint of the Library of Alexandria remains one of archaeology's most compelling mysteries. We know it stood within the royal quarter, the Bruttian district, a grand complex adjacent to the palaces and the museum. Yet modern Alexandria is a bustling metropolis built directly atop its ancient predecessor, making any excavation a complex dance with the living city. The quest to locate its halls is not about finding a treasure chest of intact scrolls. That dream is impossible given the humid Mediterranean climate that would have turned papyrus to mud within centuries. Instead, the search is for the ghostly imprint of the institution itself, the architectural bones that shaped the intellectual life that thrived there. Archaeologists like Jean-Yves Empereur, working amid the foundations of modern buildings and the waters of the harbor, have pieced together a tantalizing portrait. In the Bruttian, they have uncovered the remains of grand lecture theaters, complete with tiered seating carved from stone, where scholars would have gathered to debate and disseminate new ideas. They have identified series of small, uniform rooms lining colonnaded courtyards, spaces perfectly suited for the storage of thousands of scrolls in labeled niches. These are not the scrolls but the shelves. They are not the words but the very rooms where those words were studied. This forensic approach turns the site into a crime scene of culture, where every aligned foundation stone and every fragment of elegant mosaic hints at the scale and ambition of the original design. Finding a storage room tells us about capacity. Uncovering a lecture hall speaks to pedagogy. Mapping the relationship between these structures and the royal palaces clarifies how knowledge and power were intimately intertwined. Each discovery moves us from the realm of evocative myth into the grounded world of material reality. We trade the romantic image of endless flaming scrolls for the tangible coolness of a stone step worn smooth by the sandals of generations of thinkers. This archaeological work does something profound. It exchanges a symbol for a place. It grounds the great, abstract tragedy of lost knowledge in the very real mortar and limestone that once housed it. And in doing so, it opens a new line of inquiry. If we can definitively map the library's layout, we might one day read its architecture like a text, understanding how the flow of its spaces encouraged collaboration or solitude, public debate or private study. The stones may yet hold clues to the library's final chapter, not recorded in any history, silent witnesses to its decline, its repurposing, and its ultimate disappearance beneath the city it helped make immortal. The stones may be silent, but the story they tell is anything but quiet. Across centuries, the burning of the Library of Alexandria has transcended its own history to become a potent myth, a symbolic shorthand for a fear that never truly leaves us, the terror of a dark age. In the popular imagination, it crystallizes a stark and satisfying narrative, a single, catastrophic night where barbarism, whether in the form of a foreign invader or religious fanaticism, triumphantly extinguished the light of reason. This simplified version is powerful because it speaks to a deep cultural anxiety about how fragile civilization really is, how the accumulated wisdom of generations can be undone in a moment of violence or ignorance. The myth reduces a complex, centuries-long decline into a dramatic morality play, a clear battle between enlightenment and its enemies, and that clarity is what gives the story its enduring grip on our collective consciousness. We see this narrative weaponized again and again throughout history, repurposed to serve contemporary ideological battles. During the European Enlightenment, philosophers invoked the library's destruction as a cautionary tale against the tyranny of the Church, a symbol of how dogma could crush free inquiry. In modern political rhetoric, it is often cited as a warning about censorship or the dangers of anti-intellectual movements. The historical truth, a slow erosion through budget cuts, material decay, and a final, targeted demolition, is far less dramatically useful than the image of a glorious repository consumed in a single, villainous blaze. This raises a compelling question. Why does this particular loss resonate so much more deeply than the destruction of other great libraries? The library at Pergamon, with its 200,000 volumes, was gifted by Mark Antony to Cleopatra and absorbed into Alexandria's own collection, its end folded into the larger tragedy. The Imperial Library of Constantinople was sacked by Crusaders in the year 1204. A catastrophic event for Byzantine scholarship that receives far less attention in Western classrooms. The difference lies in what Alexandria represented, a unique, unrepeatable moment of universal ambition. It was not just a library, it was the first and last attempt to gather all the world's knowledge in one place, driven by a vision of human understanding as a single, interconnected whole. Its destruction therefore symbolizes not just a loss of books, but the shattering of that universalist dream itself. The myth endures because it mirrors our own modern dilemmas. In an age of information overload and digital fragility, we recognize the same vulnerability, the fear that our own cultural memory, now stored in vast but invisible data centers, could be corrupted, deleted, or locked away. We retell the story of Alexandria as a ritual of warning, a way to remind ourselves that preservation is not passive. It is a conscious, continuous act of defense against the entropy of time and the carelessness of power. Uncovering the messy, complicated historical truth does not diminish the power of the myth, it deepens it. It shifts the lesson from a simple tale of good versus evil to a more profound and demanding understanding that the greatest threats to knowledge are often slow, quiet, and bureaucratic, and that the true guardians of civilization are not just the creators of ideas, but the relentless, unsung copyists, translators, and archivists who keep the conversation alive across the ages. Meanwhile, another fragile lifeline stretched across the Mediterranean, one that would ultimately deliver the ancient world to the doorstep of the Renaissance. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we call Byzantium, became a fortress for Greek language and learning long after Rome fell in the West. In the great city of Constantinople, scholars and scribes maintained libraries and schools, copying and studying classical texts in the original Greek. This was a direct, unbroken lineage, a thread stretching back to antiquity itself. But when political and military pressures mounted, the precious manuscripts needed a new, more secure home. They found it not in palaces but in cloisters, across the rugged landscapes of Europe, from the misty coasts of Ireland to the alpine valleys of Switzerland. Monastic communities became the unexpected guardians of a fading world. Within the silent scriptoria of these monasteries, monks dedicated their lives to a sacred duty, the preservation of the written word. For hours each day, by the flickering light of candles, they bent over parchment, their quills scratching out perfect copies of texts they had saved from ruin. This act of copying was itself a form of prayer, a labor of devotion that they believed brought them closer to divine truth. Yet this very devotion placed a powerful and ultimately narrowing filter over what would survive. The monastic mission was not to preserve human knowledge in its entirety, but to save souls. Their selection criteria were not set by librarians, but by theologians. Works by the Church Fathers, like Augustine or Jerome, were copied with utmost urgency and care. Pagan classical texts presented a more complicated problem. A philosopher like Plato, with his theory of a single highest good and an immortal soul, could be carefully interpreted to align with Christian doctrine. Aristotle's logic provided a powerful tool for structuring theological argument. These giants were therefore saved, but their works were often copied with accompanying Christian commentaries that framed their ideas within a safe, orthodox context. They were preserved, but they were also baptized. The filter grew far more severe for works that held no obvious theological utility. The brilliant comedies of Menander, which explored the intricacies of human relationships with wit and empathy, were seen as frivolous, even dangerous distractions from spiritual contemplation. The detailed mechanical treatises of engineers like Philo offered no insight into scripture. The vibrant lyric poetry of Sappho spoke of an earthly passion that monastic life was meant to transcend. These texts, with no perceived pathway to God, were simply not prioritized. In countless monastic libraries, such scrolls and codices sat on remote shelves, untouched by the scribe's hand. Without active recopying, their fate was sealed. The parchment slowly degraded, eaten by insects or damaged by damp. When a precious new text needed to be recorded, an old, faded pagan manuscript might be deemed the perfect source of reusable parchment. Its original content would be scraped away, a palimpsest created, to make room for another copy of the Psalms or a saint's life. This was not an act of malice, but of tragic practicality. The monastic pipeline saved a civilization, but it delivered a carefully curated sample. The Renaissance scholars who later rediscovered these classical works in monastery libraries were receiving a filtered inheritance. They marveled at the recovered wisdom of Plato and Aristotle, unaware of the rich chorus of other voices that had once surrounded them, voices that had been left to molder in the dark because no monk, centuries before, could see God in their pages. This second great filter, applied with pious intent, compounded the initial losses of Alexandria, ensuring that the classical revival would be built on a foundation that was brilliant but profoundly incomplete. The Hollywood image of a single, roaring inferno is a powerful fiction, but history rarely grants such clean endings. To understand how the library truly disappeared, we must replace that one dramatic fire with a longer, slower, and more complex timeline of erosion. The process unfolded across centuries, a series of distinct events separated by long periods of quiet decay, each chipping away at the great institution until nothing remained. The first major blow came in 48 before the Common Era, with Julius Caesar's desperate naval fire in the harbor. This event likely did not touch the main library building in the royal quarter, but it almost certainly incinerated a priceless overflow collection stored in the dock warehouses. These were scrolls fresh from across the Mediterranean, unique works awaiting cataloging, a loss of potential that struck at the library's very purpose of gathering all knowledge. For the next 300 years, the library persisted, but it faced a creeping enemy far less cinematic than flames, a steady decline in imperial support. As Roman priorities shifted, the generous Ptolemaic funding that paid for scribes, acquisitions, and scholars gradually dried up. The library became a prestigious relic, maintained by tradition but no longer at the vibrant center of intellectual life. Then, in the 270s of the Common Era, the city of Alexandria itself became a battleground. Emperor Aurelian fought a brutal war to recapture the city from a separatist queen, and historical accounts describe widespread damage to the entire Bruttian district, the very neighborhood housing the library and the museum. While we lack a specific report of the library burning, the sheer scale of the urban combat makes it highly probable that the complex suffered severe damage, whether from deliberate targeting, collateral fire, or looting in the chaotic aftermath. This event would have been a devastating physical blow to the infrastructure and any collection still housed there, yet even this was not the final end. The last definitive act of destruction was not an accident of war, but a deliberate ideological purge. In 391, following the emperor's edicts against paganism, the Christian patriarch Theophilus led a mob to destroy the Serapeum, the great temple complex that housed a major daughter library. This was a calculated demolition of a pagan intellectual stronghold, and whatever precious scrolls on philosophy, science, and history remained within its walls were almost certainly consumed. This nuanced timeline transforms our understanding. The library's demise was not a sudden murder but a prolonged fading, caused by a combination of accidental fire, military conflict, financial neglect, and finally, targeted religious violence. It died from 1,000 cuts, the slow rot of papyrus in underfunded storage rooms, the changing technology that made its scrolls obsolete, the political instability that turned a center of learning into a battlefield, and the ideological shift that rendered its core mission not just forgotten but heretical. Replacing the simple villain narrative with this layered history reveals a more profound and perhaps more unsettling truth. Great institutions of knowledge are not typically toppled by a single barbarian at the gate. They are far more often dismantled piece by piece through a society's changing priorities, its conflicts, and its quiet decision to stop caring for the treasures of its past. This patient science of reconstruction is called fragmentology. It is the meticulous art of listening for echoes in a silent hall. Modern scholars act as literary archaeologists, but their dig site is not the earth, it is the vast landscape of texts that did survive. They sift through the works of later philosophers, historians, and even encyclopedists, searching for a precious reference, a passing quote, or a hostile critique that preserves a sliver of something gone. The process is slow, painstaking, and often heartbreakingly incomplete. Yet it has managed to salvage ghostly outlines from the void. For example, the towering tragedies of Aeschylus are known to us only in part because other ancient writers, like the philosopher Plato or the orator Aristides, would quote a powerful line from a lost play to make their own point. We know his play, The Myrmidons, existed, and we have a few of its stirring lines, only because someone else found them too memorable to leave unsaid. These fragments are like finding a single, beautiful piece of stained glass from a cathedral window that has otherwise vanished. We can admire its color and craftsmanship, but we can only guess at the magnificent, complete image it was once part of. A more tangible form of this detective work happens with actual physical fragments. In the late 19th century, archaeologists began excavating the ancient Egyptian town of Oxyrhynchus. For centuries, its inhabitants had used discarded papyrus, including scraps of literary works, as waste material, stuffing for mummy casings, scrap for cartonnage, or simply trash. This municipal rubbish heap, preserved by the dry desert air, became one of the greatest treasure troves in classical scholarship. From these mounds of fragmentary papyrus, researchers have recovered otherwise unknown poems by Sappho, lost lines from Sophocles, and even pieces of forgotten scientific manuals. Each scrap is a message in a bottle, washed ashore centuries after the shipwreck. Scholars must then perform a kind of textual triage, cleaning the fragile piece, deciphering the faded handwriting, and trying to match the style and meter to known authors or identify something entirely new. The work is a testament to human perseverance, a refusal to let silence have the final word. Yet for all its triumphs, fragmentology also underscores a painful truth. These recovered pieces are glimpses, not restorations. We might have a few dozen new lines from Sappho, but they highlight the absence of the other thousands she wrote. We can reassemble a partial plot summary from a critic's synopsis, but we cannot recreate the emotional rhythm of the performance, the actor's delivery, or the audience's gasp. The shadow library, reconstructed from quotes and rubbish heaps, is a skeleton, articulated with great care, but forever lacking the flesh, the voice, and the life it once possessed. It confirms the scale of our loss even as it mitigates it, reminding us that some chapters of the human story now exist only as a title in an ancient footnote, a subject for scholarly deduction, but never again as a living work to be experienced whole. That deep collective sorrow for what was erased has given the library a second life, not as a physical place, but as a powerful symbol in the human psyche. Long after the last stone was repurposed, the ghost of Alexandria settled into our cultural imagination as the archetype of irreversible loss. It represents a very specific kind of melancholy, a grief not for a person, but for a potential, for a future of understanding that was stolen from us all. This feeling resonates across centuries, touching thinkers as diverse as the astronomer Carl Sagan, who mourned the lost scientific chapters in his series Cosmos, and the novelist Umberto Eco, who wove the library's haunting absence into his labyrinthine tales of knowledge and secrecy. They and countless others are drawn to the story not just for its history, but for its profound emotional weight. It speaks to a fear that is almost primal, the terror that our story, our collective memory, could simply vanish, leaving no one to remember who we were or what we learned. This persistent sorrow has even been given a name by scholars, the Alexandrian Complex. It is that nagging sense that our knowledge is forever incomplete, that a golden key to understanding was melted down long ago, and we are left fumbling with the lock. This complex is not a passive sadness, it is an active, driving force. It fuels our most ambitious modern attempts to rebuild that universal library, to create a new completeness. Look at the very project you are using to access this information. Wikipedia, with its volunteer-driven mission to compile all human knowledge, is a direct descendant of the Alexandrian dream. The global push for digital libraries, for scanning every book, for preserving every website in an internet archive, these are all expressions of that same impulse, born from a deep-seated desire to ensure that no idea is ever so vulnerable again. We are trying with our new tools to build a library that cannot burn. Yet the ghost of Alexandria ensures we never become complacent. It whispers that every archive, no matter how vast or how cloud-based, carries within it the seed of its own fragility. The library's story has taught us that preservation is not a one-time act, but a perpetual state of vigilance. It has made us acutely aware of the preciousness of cultural memory, transforming it from a background fact of civilization into something we must actively cherish and defend. In this way, the library never truly died. It was transformed from a repository of scrolls into a repository of meaning, a permanent landmark in our shared consciousness that reminds us, with a quiet and solemn gravity, that what we choose to remember and what we fail to save defines the world we leave behind. The ghost of Alexandria is not the only keeper of ancient secrets. While the great library's shelves turned to dust, other caches of wisdom were quietly buried, waiting centuries for a chance to speak. In the most unexpected places, fragments of the lost intellectual world have re-emerged, offering a profound note of hope and a startling lesson about how knowledge endures. These rediscoveries prove that the ancient conversation was not wholly silenced but scattered, hidden in attics, caves, and even beneath the words of later prayers. One of the most remarkable of these rescues began not in a desert, but in a Christie's auction house in New York in 1998. The item for sale was a modest-looking medieval prayer book, its vellum pages filled with solemn hymns. But to the trained eye, the faint, ghostly traces of older, slanted Greek handwriting were visible beneath the devotional text. This was a palimpsest, a manuscript that had been scraped and reused. The undertext, it was discovered, contained the only known copies of several treatises by the legendary mathematician Archimedes. His revolutionary work, The Method, which revealed his thought process for calculating volumes and areas, had been considered lost forever. It, along with other texts, had been carefully copied in the 10th century, only to be erased 200 years later by a monk needing parchment for his prayer book. For a millennium, Archimedes' groundbreaking ideas lay hidden in plain sight. Modern technology performed a kind of intellectual archaeology, using multispectral imaging, a technique that employs different wavelengths of light. Scientists were able to see through the overlying prayers and digitally resurrect the faint, erased ink. The Archimedes palimpsest is a powerful metaphor. It tells us that knowledge is often not destroyed, but merely covered over, waiting for the right light to reveal it again. It also underscores a humbling truth: the very act of preservation in one era, the monks' pious work, nearly caused the permanent loss of a scientific treasure from an earlier age. The survival of these texts was a matter of incredible luck and modern ingenuity, a second chance granted by the confluence of parchment scarcity and 21st century imaging. What other erased masterpieces might still lie beneath the surface of later manuscripts, their contents hovering just beyond our sight? Some caches were preserved not by chance reuse but by deliberate concealment. In the late 1940s, a young Bedouin shepherd tossing a stone into a cave near the Dead Sea heard the sound of breaking pottery. Investigating, he found clay jars containing ancient leather and papyrus scrolls. This accidental discovery unveiled the Dead Sea Scrolls, a library of Jewish texts over 2,000 years old, including the oldest known copies of the Hebrew Bible. Hidden away in the dry desert air, these documents survived the rise and fall of empires entirely untouched by the fires of Alexandria or the filters of later tradition. They offered an unedited, contemporaneous view of Jewish religious life and thought from the centuries surrounding the dawn of the Common Era, texts that had circulated in the wider world but whose earliest versions were otherwise lost. Similarly, in 1945, an Egyptian farmer digging for fertilizer near the town of Nag Hammadi unearthed a sealed clay jar. Inside were 13 leather-bound codices containing over 50 religious texts. These were Gnostic gospels and treatises, alternative visions of early Christian spirituality that had been suppressed and largely eradicated by the Orthodox Church. The Nag Hammadi Library, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, was a time capsule buried by a community likely seeking to protect its sacred writings from destruction. These desert libraries did not contain the lost plays of Sophocles or the maps of Pythias, but they performed the same essential function as Alexandria on a smaller scale. They preserved voices that the mainstream had chosen to forget or condemn, ensuring that dissenting ideas from the ancient world still had a chance to be heard. Their survival in remote caves reminds us that when knowledge is threatened in the centers of power, it often flees to the margins, finding refuge in the earth itself. These finds fundamentally change our understanding of loss. They show that the transmission of texts is not a clean, linear process from library to library. It is a chaotic, unpredictable journey full of near misses and miraculous survivals. A single copy, tucked into a jar and forgotten in a cave, can outlast every magnificent scroll in a royal archive. This pattern suggests that while the Alexandrian loss was catastrophic, it may not have been absolute. The intellectual output of the ancient world was not stored in one single, vulnerable vault. It was duplicated, carried by travelers, traded by merchants, and hidden by communities across 3 continents. This scattering means that hope, however faint, is not irrational. A papyrus fragment buried in the sands of Egypt, a palimpsest waiting in a monastery library, or even a scroll carbonized by the eruption of Vesuvius and now being read by X-ray, any of these could still hold a line from a lost play, a page from a forgotten history, or a diagram from an extinct science. The story of Alexandria's loss is tempered by these surprising returns. They tell us that the past is not a sealed tomb, but a landscape still being excavated, where every shard of pottery and every scrap of text has the potential to revise the story we tell about ourselves. The great library may be gone, but its mission, the gathering and safeguarding of human thought, continues in every archaeological dig, every digital archive, and every act of scholarly recovery that pulls another piece of the mosaic back from the brink of silence. The ultimate lesson from Alexandria's ashes is not about a building, but about a responsibility. We often mistake preservation for a single act of safekeeping, like locking a treasure in a vault. But the library's long, fragmented demise reveals a deeper truth. Knowledge is not a relic to be stored, it is a conversation that must be kept alive. The Ptolemies understood the first part brilliantly. They collected the world's scrolls with relentless ambition. Yet their model contained a fatal flaw. It centralized that conversation in one vulnerable place. When the scribes stopped copying, when the scholars stopped debating, when the scrolls were no longer read but merely stored, the collection began to die long before any fire touched it. This is the critical distinction between storage and stewardship. Storage is passive, it assumes the object itself is enough. Stewardship is active, it understands that the idea within the object must be continuously transmitted, translated, and tested by new minds. The monks in their scriptoria, despite their narrow filter, were stewards. They engaged with the texts, copied them by hand, and in that very act of laborious transcription, they kept a thread of the ancient world alive. The scholars in Baghdad were stewards. They did not just archive Greek science, they argued with it, corrected it, and built magnificent new structures upon its foundations. The library's real tragedy was a failure of ongoing stewardship at the source. Its vast collection became a trophy, a symbol of prestige that outlasted the vibrant, participatory intellectual culture it was meant to fuel. This legacy presents us with a stark and urgent mandate. We are not called to be mere curators of the past, dutifully labeling and shelving the artifacts of thought. We are called to be active participants in a conversation that stretches across millennia. Our role is to listen to those ancient voices, yes, but then to respond, to add our own chapter, and to ensure the dialogue is passed on, louder and richer, to those who come after us. This shifts the entire frame of reference. It asks us to look at our own world, at our towering digital archives, and pose a difficult question. Are we building libraries or are we building tombs? We have assembled the most comprehensive record of human thought in history, from scanned medieval manuscripts to real-time social media posts, all stored in vast server farms. But this is storage on an unimaginable scale. True stewardship requires more. It demands that we design these systems not just for durability, but for engagement. It means creating digital tools that allow for annotation, for translation into new languages and formats, for open access that invites debate and reinterpretation. It means fighting against the digital decay of broken links and obsolete file types with the same vigilance a scribe fought against mold and bookworms. Most importantly, it means valuing context and understanding as much as we value the raw data itself. A petabyte of information is meaningless if no one knows how to read it or why it matters. The ghost of Alexandria whispers that the greatest threat to knowledge is not deletion but irrelevance. When an idea is no longer discussed, no longer challenged, no longer woven into the living fabric of our culture, it might as well be ash. So the library's final lesson is a call to action. It asks us to be gardeners of wisdom, not warehouse clerks, to nurture the living roots of understanding, to pollinate ideas across generations, and to ensure that the great human conversation, in all its diversity and disagreement, never falls silent again. What are we doing right now to keep the voices in our own archive from becoming just another echo in a forgotten hall? The true cost of Alexandria is measured not in scrolls, but in the narrowing of our shared imagination. We have walked through the echoes of its vanished halls, past the ghostly shelves that once held the complete works of playwrights, the definitive histories of ancient empires, and the revolutionary scientific theories that flickered out too soon. This was not a single catastrophic fire, but a long, slow unraveling. It was a cascade of failures, a story where war, shifting priorities, and finally, ideological certainty each played a part in dismantling the greatest repository of human thought the world had ever known. The ultimate tragedy is not merely the loss of information, but the foreclosure of potential futures. With each unique scroll that crumbled or burned, a door closed. A different path for science, a richer understanding of history, an alternative philosophy for living, all were sealed away, leaving our intellectual inheritance more linear and in subtle ways more fragile. This history, however, is not just a monument to absence. It is a mirror. It reflects our own modern vulnerabilities, our own centralized digital repositories, and our own battles against the quiet decay of data and the shifting sands of cultural priority. The lesson of Alexandria is not one of despair, but of urgent stewardship. It teaches us that preservation is never a passive act. It is a conscious, continuous choice to engage, to copy, to debate, and to pass on. Knowledge does not live in vaults, it lives in conversation. It thrives when it is read, challenged, translated, and woven into the fabric of a new generation's understanding. We are all, in a sense, the librarians now. The call to action is clear: to value the fragile threads of understanding in our own lives, to support the institutions and individuals who keep the great human dialogue alive, and to remember that what we choose to save or neglect defines the world we leave behind. If this journey through lost wisdom has resonated with you, consider subscribing for more explorations into the shadows of history. And we would love to hear in the comments if you could recover one single work from those vanished shelves. Which lost voice would you most want to hear speak again?